able to join us tonight for our second panel of the Cultúr Raum discussion series called Talking About the Past, Challenges in Institutions of Cultural Heritage, Language and Education. A warm welcome also to our wonderful guests tonight, Lynn Scarf, Dr. Donald Hesset, Dr. Laila Essa, and Ngozi Shomas. I'm very excited and looking forward to a lively discussion with you all, and it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our host tonight, Hansong Hildmann. Hansong currently serves as Associate Advisor for International Relations at the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, seconded by the Goethe-Institut. Before, he worked as a director of the Goethe-Institut in Singapore, so Hansong was a colleague of us for several years. He has been active in the fields of arts management and international cultural relations for more than a decade, working for different public German and European institutions. My thanks to everyone for joining us tonight for this very important discussion and conversation, and I hand over to you, Hansong.
Thank you, Ulrike, for the nice introduction, and thank you to all the speakers joining this roundtable. The topic today is talking about the past, challenges in institutions of cultural heritage, language and education. And I hope we won't only talk about the past, but also about the present and the future. And what we would like to tackle in this roundtable today are issues of colonial history, of imperial pasts, but also about the importance of public heritage, of memory culture, or even contested memories, but also about the role of the arts, of the contemporary arts, what it plays and what it has for an impact in this kind of contexts. So we talk about a very broad issue today, and before we start, I would like to give a quick introduction to the speakers today. We have Lynn Scarf here with us, the director of the National Museum of Ireland. Lynn Scarf has also been the director of the Science Gallery in Dublin, in which during the time she led the institutions through a process of organizational change, strategic planning and development. She has been also part of the initial development team, where she developed a program of compelling cultural experiences that explored the boundaries of art and science. In 2012, she was part of the leadership team that established the Global Science Gallery Network, bringing the vision of the Science Gallery to 8 cities globally by 2020. Lynn, if I may say so, advocates the participative museum, and your work is also often referred to as being embedded in collaborative practice, which I would love to learn more about later in this discussion. Lynn's research work also focuses on non-formal learning setting and new ways of engagements with diverse audiences. I'm also very happy to welcome Ngozi Shomas, who is a Nigerian-German multidisciplinary artist based in Bremen, in Germany, and in Takoradi in Ghana. Her practice is referring to subjects of representation, identity, equality, but also memory, migration, and colonialism. In my understanding, immediate locality is also an ongoing reference point to you, as you are living in West Africa and Europe, not living, but also being active as an artist. You have exhibitions in Bremen and Lagos. Your works are presented in Sweden and USA. And I'm very curious to learn more about the exhibition you had in 2019 at the National Museum in Lagos called The Way We Mask, which I read a little bit about and which I'm very curious to learn more about in this round. I'm very happy to welcome Donald Hesset. He is a lecturer in the French department at the University College of Cork in Ireland. He holds a PhD from the Department of History and Civilization at the European University-Institute in Florence. His research is addressing language of politics, colonialism, commemoration, culture, and public heritage. I hope I summarized it in the right way. He's also leading the IRC-funded New Foundations workshop on decolonizing Irish public heritage. Also very extremely interesting topic I would like to discuss in this round later. I also would like to welcome Laila Esser. She is lecturer in comparative literature, and before joining the Utrecht University in 2021, she was a teaching fellow in the Department of Germanic Studies at the Trinity College in Dublin. She holds a PhD in German, English, and comparative literature. By the way, I also studied comparative, not literature, but comparative linguistics. So maybe we have suffered the similar pains during our academic times, if I may say so. Laila's practices and research is referring to post-migration, colonial history, and literature in the context of current memory discourse. And her most recent research, if I'm correct, is focusing on post-migrant practices, and she's also active in the Post-Migrant Writers Network. To my understanding, active in a way, researching about it and also being part of the network, if I understand it rightly. Also a very interesting insight probably there will be very interesting insights I would love to learn more about later. So this is our round for tonight. And I would like to start with a very general approach, since this topic is very wide. Maybe some of you can share in which context our discussion or our discourse in terms of memory culture, post-colonialism is relevant in our field of work. What are the most pressing issues you encounter in your direct vicinity? Maybe I can invite Ngozi Shomers to speak first.
Oh, thank you so much, Hanson. Happy to be in this panel with you all. Yeah, in my area of field, I've always focused on, I'm really interested in culture, and I've always focused in getting to know people that I interact with, I see every day, and most times understanding also their culture. So moving around from Nigeria to Germany, and then Germany, like splitting it and living as well, not leaving that space entirely, but still having a home in Africa, in Ghana, moving to Ghana, and then kind of living but living in Ghana, and then being able to travel to Ghana to Nigeria all the time. When I'm in Ghana, I make sure that I visit home as well. So I kind of try to understand how people live instead of kind of imposing my ideas to these people. And when I moved to Germany, it was also important to learn the language. But again, when you sometimes learning language, when we talk of past, sometimes people want to forget entirely their past. But in my work, it's not easy for me to forget my past, because I see constant memory triggers that takes me back to, where I'm from, and remembering, okay, this happened to me in that space, and is not so different from what I'm encountering in this space. So that's all the things I try to bring in my work. And yeah, and then I start seeing the issues we have, me being a female artist that is Black, and then seeing how that space adjusts to me, or even want to show my work in their space, or have those dialogues that I'm having, without just reducing it to a particular idea or how they want to even say it. Because most times when people from certain areas want to, from certain places or spaces want to show their work, is always tied to one specific idea. Maybe just talk about culture or talk about colonization. Nobody wants to see the broad idea that you can pick certain things from it. That I'm referring to texture, I'm referring to lines, I'm referring to so many layers in the work. I'm referring to forms, dance, or anything. Still just want to put my work into one thing, or even that I'm talking of climate when I create my work. So they want to just narrow it down and put it in a box. So to even get into a space, so I like that. I lack that accessibility because I've been boxed up into a very small, into a very small box, and sometimes it's really hard to kind of witness this, but it hasn't stopped. My discourse is still from the same place. People I see around me, and that I'm a woman, so women are very constant in my dialogue, that they inspire me, my lifestyle inspire me, my experiences as a human inspires me, not just not what how people want to say it most of the times. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you, Ngozi.
Thank you.
I mean, I hear out that the issues of categorization or imposed categorization is something you are facing in your practice, and
yes, yes,
very nice
and divide because like when I talk to friends as well, my work is basically based seriously on research. Like I talk to people, and when I talk to friends as well, I hear like there's a whole lot of divide or separation that is also involved in this whole thing, that there is space for certain artworks, and there is space for for maybe better, or what everybody can say something to, or have something to say about, and this is like very it's really bad to be experiencing that today, that we still have this separation in the way our work is displayed or talked about. So this is also a very bad, minus being a woman as well. This is just a very bad experience that we have to go through every day. Yeah,
I see. Mm-hmm. Lynn, may I bring you in here as a museum director, or let me start different. You also have a residency program for artists at your museum. So you also work in the realm of history and memorial culture, but also in the field of contemporary art. How does what Ngozi just explained resonates with you as a head of an institution and a museum working with contemporary artists?
Well, first of all, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for asking me. It's wonderful to be on a panel with you all. It's interesting your question, Hansong, because when Ngozi started to speak, one of the first things you said is I like to understand how people live, and I wrote it down because I just have it down here in my notebook because when you said it, it echoed with me a lot. Primarily, so as you mentioned, Hans, within the museum at the moment, we have artist in residency programs. So we currently have an artist in residence, Anthony Haughey. He's specifically looking around the theme. I think many of you will obviously know we have the Decade of Centenaries in Ireland at the moment. And so he's working around that particular theme and very much around the area of memory, and he's done a lot of substantial work with communities. But that piece around understanding how people live and in some ways creating the space for reflection on that, I think echoes very much what we would hope for within our museum. So just by way of explanation, the National Museum of Ireland is it's a national cultural institution, and so it it conserves, protects and collects the national collection, and so it is an old institution, and like many old institutions, it has a lot of structures and history that are related to colonial structures fundamentally. And at the same time, I think it's also a museum that's currently in operation in 21st century Ireland, which is, a multicultural, diverse community. And so, what Ngozi mentions about that piece about understanding how people live, I suppose as a museum director, strategically, we're thinking within our organization, how do we make sure that everybody that walks through the door of our national cultural institution sees their identity reflected in the collection? And what do we do to make, to ensure that that occurs? And how do we engage with communities? How do we engage around our collecting practices? How do we engage around our workforce and the diversity of our workforce? How do we talk about the way that we curate and collaborate with artists, but also with communities? How do we, in some ways, think about things like that sort of traditional authoritative voice that is often associated with colonial structures and move ourselves more into something that's a bit more about an authentic voice that is genuine and reaching out to the people that we work with. So all of these things, it's such a big topic, and I don't want to hog all of the time. But I suppose if I think about your question, Hansong, and what Ngozi says, that piece around understanding how people live, and then taking that in terms of what the artists can do in their practice within the museum, both with the collections that we have, but also with the communities that we serve. I think that's something, that expertise and that experience is something that's quite unique. And certainly our experience of it within the National Museum is that I think particularly when you are approaching areas of, that are perhaps more contested history, or that are difficult, I think that collaboration and that process of engagement that comes through a kind of artistic practice can be hugely, I think, rewarding and beneficial for all involved. But it has to be very much a kind of genuine partnership. And I think that, one of the questions that you were saying at the beginning is what brings us all to this. And I suppose as a director of an organization, my role is really thinking about the strategy of an organization to move it fundamentally in that direction and what that requires. And that requires change, cultural change, which is, let's be honest, probably one of the most difficult things to achieve in long established institutions. And we're very lucky in the museum that we have a team that are very engaged in that. But I think thinking that takes time, and it also requires us to be very open and reach out to, you know, to the community, to other experts in the field, to work with us, you know.
Mm-hmm. Maybe before we move on, maybe one question specifically to that, Lynn, what do you think can, like, an artistic perspective on these issues provide what, like, a historic or ethnographical or scientific perspective cannot? I mean, what is sort of the uniqueness of the artistic perspective on all this issue, which other disciplines can't?
Well, I think Ngozi is probably more in a position to answer that question than me, because it is her practice, and as much as I would like to be, you know, in artistic practice, unfortunately, I'm not. So I think she's probably got a better overview of what her kind of work brings to places like the museum. From my perspective, what it brings is another voice, another perspective, another way of seeing. I'm really interested in the dynamic that exists between the artist and the community that they're in this kind of practice, between the artist and the community that they're working with. So the process that occurs there. And then the third part, which is the audience. And so there's an interesting dynamic that occurs in the context of cultural institutions and this kind of work, which is that you oftentimes have an ongoing process of the artist who's maybe very, very much involved in working with the community around a particular work. And then a third part of that relationship comes in, which is the audience, and they're very much, you know, part of that as well. And I think that dynamic between that partnership is a really interesting one. And that, I think, begins to offer interesting perspectives. So at the moment, just speaking about the museum's own experience, and, you know, Anthony Hohe, who's been our artist in residence since July, has just spent the last number of months wandering around the museum, looking at different spaces, understanding the collection, thinking about the communities. And he started to bring people into the museum that maybe felt that the museum wasn't a place for them, wasn't somewhere that they were necessarily. And so that kind of process of engagement, I think, is often what these relationships can bring. But they're very nuanced. I don't think you can kind of say there's an overarching. It's very much to do with the, you know, particular artist and their practice, the community that you're in, the particular institution, and the dialogue that happens between all of those different elements.
Right. I've seen your conversation with Anthony Hohe, and like one quote by him remained with me. He was quoting Walter Benjamin, and he was saying, he was talking about the history as looking back and looking forward at the history at the same time, which I found brought it quite nicely on the point. Maybe this can be a starting point for you, Donal. And if I may, if we may remain on the issue of the role of the museums for a moment, I have read your very intriguing article about the museum in Belgium. I had written it down here, but you know better than me what I'm referring to. Do you mind to give us a little bit, a few insights on that? Because I think in that article you have pinpointed very important issues of the role of the museum and how they deal with their colonial past, with their collection, and how objects are presented.
Thank you very much, and I'm really honoured to be here with such great fellow panelists. So I wrote recently a piece about the newly reopened Africa Museum in Tervuren, just outside Brussels, which was this notorious colonial museum often labelled the last colonial museum in Europe. So its collection had not radically changed, but not radically changed in its presentation since the independence of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. So it closed in 2013 for a major program of renovation, and a lot of money was invested in the program. But the final result was something that many, including myself, were quite disappointed with for a number of reasons. And I think it's a really interesting case for us to study, because what went wrong, in my view, at least in the museum, is indicative of some of the issues that face institutions when they try to tackle these questions around colonialism and the legacies of colonialism. So one of the things that happened was that the museum invited in representatives from the Afro-Belgian community, who were artists and art historians, highly qualified people, but they were actually only really consulted for their positionalities as Black Belgians, and that their expertise was not fully recognised in the process, and that they were kind of there to provide, you know, what was called in one context sensitivity expertise. So to adjudicate whether something was racist or not. And this, I think, speaks to what Ngozi was saying about categorization. So these people appeared who were experts with real valuable contributions to make, and yet they were categorized solely on the basis of who they were and what they looked like. And then when we looked at the museum itself, there was an effort to recast its collection as the heritage of humanity and universal, without really addressing, you know, how that collection came to be in the possession of an institution in Belgium, without addressing the contested ownership of that collection and the fact that institutions in Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi were claiming restitution of those objects. And I think that speaks to something that Lynn has also mentioned, which is one of the really exciting things about these kind of discussions and the practices that are happening by artists and by heritage professionals, is the move away from the museum as this old vision of the universal, which is a Eurocentric vision of universal, emerged during the Enlightenment, in which Europe is the home of science and Europe will be the repository of all knowledge about humanity. So museums were going to be these spaces in which institutions where knowledge of humanity was expressed, but through a European lens. And moving away from that vision of universalism towards a vision of universalism that the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne called Lateral Universalism, which is a universalism in which different cultures come together and form a culture or a history or a heritage of humanity that is the sum of its parts. It's not something imposed towards one model of knowledge or one model of institution or one model of artistic production, but one that draws on the strengths of different models. So it's not about completely separating different parts of the world and denying this kind of universal reality of human experience, but it's also not about imposing a certain vision of universalism for Europe. And that's where I think these conversations are really exciting. And when I see heritage professionals here in Ireland and other parts of the world engage with these issues, I know that they can see the potential of what a museum could look like if we embrace that model. So what would a museum look like in Ireland, for example, if Ireland was to have you know, an exhibition about Guinness jointly organized with Nigeria, which is the other great country of Guinness? You know, how would that change the way that we understand ourselves? And I think there's a real great potential there. And what's exciting is that I really get the impression that there's goodwill towards that here in Ireland, and that there's a real effort in our heritage institutions to achieve that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that works out.
Thank you, Donald. I mean, I think to move away from the universal, and I think that's a very important sort of key sentence. I mean, you could say move away from the universal. I think it's also a very critical reflection on normativity, that it's questioned, that we cannot refer to a normativity anymore for very, very good reasons, and we know that it causes more problems than it solves issues. Laila, in your practice, in terms of comparative literature, but also being in the academic research. Would you say that this move away from the universal and questioning normativities, I mean, you must encounter that in your daily practices as being active in these networks of yours, but also when you are dealing with different knowledge systems which are embedded in language, which sort of appears in a other very striking way. Can you give us some insights into that?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, first of all, also thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to digitally be back in Dublin and in such great company. Yeah, I was actually thinking just now that question of normativity, the question of universal versus particular considerations link so much to my research interests, and then also link back to some of the issues you've touched upon introducing me in terms of like my different research interests, because where I'm coming from originally, well, my PhD isn't very long ago. I only finished I think around 2 years ago this time. I had just handed it in. And my original big research project there also absolutely dealt with questions of how memory plays into conceptions of community in the present day. But there I very much looked at the way that contemporary novels on Germany and on India kind of narrate the division, so the partition of India and Pakistan, the East-West division of Germany, how they narrate them now in the context of current right-wing moves, right? And so the colonial history context that I referred to there was very much the colonial Indian context, whereas in the German context, I was focusing more on the Cold War division. And as I then finished that project, I mean, I'm still thinking about it, of course, but as I'm developing my new research project now, that is more concerned with these networks you've touched upon there of writers writing kind of post-migrant Germany and Britain today. And what I mean there by network is not so much one specific like set network with like members or not. That's also why it's kind of like a very fluid thing to say, like when you say like, oh, you're part of the network. I think on my official institutional bio, I have this line about being active in those networks, and it's very much about networks of authors that are publicly engaging with questions of what should be remembered and where society should be going right now. And I'm decidedly working on very politically outspoken authors for this new project. And I think one reason why I emphasized my being active in those networks in the bio there is precisely that there is a certain bias in academia, I guess, like to stay away from things that also personally have to do with you, right? Like so, or either to focus solely on that which kind of biographically aligns with what you're doing. So it's either like, why are you working on India and not on Egypt, or now, right, that there is a certain like I realized that kind of by working on authors networks with that are kind of sharing factors that are also, like, as a person, as the Germans say, mit Migrationshintergrund, things that are relevant to me in that I'm making myself vulnerable to kind of like saying like, oh, but, like, are you researching this because of that? And at the same time, what I mean by being active, right? Like, I am particularly looking at authors that are connecting to each other and to the wider public through kind of new media, through social media, that are making use of all these very, like open, not very gate-kept mechanisms in order to be in touch with each other. And that's why I kind of wanted to foreground actually looking at fluid networks is something that I actively want to participate in here. And one thing I found really interesting in kind of thinking about our topic for today and the role of literature in memory is not just what I've kind of like been looking at in my first project, that the significance of literature in memorializing the like more distant past, like whether that's the national partition, whether that's then, of course, there's also a body of literature on the German colonial history, for example. But one thing I'm very interested in contemporary literature now too is that these networks, that a lot of the literature that comes out of it is also in the process, I guess, of writing literary works that memorialize much more recent, atrocities in Germany, particularly if we focus on the German side of it, that otherwise, like might not have gotten the official recognition that they deserve. So that there's a whole bunch of novels that have come out in the last year alone, or in the last few months, dealing with far-right terrorist attacks, for example, or even directly memorializing terrorist attacks that have only happened like in the last year and a bit, right? Like there's I have a few of them here next to me, right? But there are books like Sanyal's Identity, which reference the Hanau terrorist attacks. I'm also thinking about the role of literature in pointing towards this memorialization, where maybe other institutions are failing in providing the kind of memorialization that's necessary there. I hope this answered the question somewhat. So.
Thank you, Laila. Donal, would you like to tap into that further, since you have done significant research on memorial culture? What is your take on the current topic of far away historical memorization and recent memorial culture of recent event? I mean, the whole culture of memory, of monuments, is highly contested these days. How we deal with memorial sites, or rather, especially more complicated if it's about statues who have very problematic representational issues. Maybe some insight on that from you.
Well, firstly, I'd say that this is in no way a new phenomenon. So memory has always been politically contested, and there has always been discourses in society that monuments are permanent, and yet history has shown that they are not permanent, and they never were meant to be permanent. So that I personally, very much of the view that a monument exists as a reflection of a society's attitude towards its past, which is about the present, and it's not so much about the past. As a historian, I completely reject any idea that we learn about our past through statues and through monuments. Germany is the prime example of that. Nobody needs a statue of Adolf Hitler to learn about Nazism. So I'm very skeptical about much of that kind of conservative conservationist discourse around statues, which is much more about maintaining a certain form of supremacy, symbolic supremacy in the public space, whether that's a white racial supremacy or whether it's a male patriarchal supremacy. And that I think there really is space for creative interventions in society around these topics. But I think, we've been lucky to avoid largely, at least recently in Ireland, the kind of escalation of a culture war discourse around these topics that we've seen, particularly across the water in Britain. And that is perhaps connected to the fact that, Ireland's own experience of empire as a colonial, as a colony, but also as a society that participated to a certain extent in the exploitation of overseas colonies, gives us some sort of insights that allow us to think, hopefully, a bit more nuanced about this phenomenon. But I would say that it's quite interesting. The public discourse often says, "Oh, history is under attack. History is under attack," and yet most professional historians do not have in any way this fixed idea of history with a capital H as one immovable concept. Rather, it is it's a field of discourse in which we present different visions of the past and what they tell us about our present and our future.
Right. I mean, that sort of statues cannot tell us much about history, or that we don't need statues to learn about the history. And that is one takeaway I would take along. I mean, could we go as far as saying that even not statues, but who are like displayed in public realm, but what about ethnographical objects? I mean, do they face similar challenges of representations nowadays?
I just say quickly on that I think, you know, and museums are increasingly sensitive to this idea, but what is called an ethnographical object is very much dependent on where it's from, and what we class as artworks in Europe, objects from similar periods and similar contexts of cultural production are classed as ethnographic objects in museums about African or South Asian heritage. And that shows the endurance of a colonial lens in understanding objects. And I think this is a space in which there is real debate and change taking place in cultural institutions within Europe, as people are beginning to see that an object of cultural production from West Africa from a certain period is the equivalent of an object of cultural production from another period. And then vice versa, objects of ordinary life are presented in this kind of exoticized, fetishized way if they come from some parts of the world, and then that they're presented as normative if they come from other parts of the world. And this is really where the crux of debate is lying in museum practice, that I'm sure both Ngozi and Lynn could speak to with more detail than me.
Ngozi, would you like to add on to that?
Yeah, I really agree with him. We need to start, museums really need to focus on seeing how they could display these works in a way that is not really painful or disturbing when you're working. I mean, I have a work when I collaborated with Kunsthalle Bremen. It has to do with the exhibition, The Blind Spots. And my work was to work with objects from the Übersee Museum, which is a transatlantic museum. And they were the tea cans, the old tea cans with those funny images of Black people, representational images of Black people, or how we are, or how we really like doing those jobs or enjoy. Nobody, like those things does not show you what happened during that time or during colonial times, that people were forced to do this work. And we still talk about fair trade and similar things. Then you're seeing other small objects that are there, and some things are not even properly categorized, that are just dumped. You can't tell, like, where is this from? And I think museums should really, in as much as most times when we have these discourses, it comes up, oh, that they don't have enough money to do it. But there is a way to kind of ask people, like, when you're walking and you're looking for things, you can't find them because they've been displayed in the worst manner. It's really not nice. So I totally agree with it. It's about time that it should start happening, not just we talking about it. And because this stuff has been going on for a while now. Yes, that's yeah.
Lynn, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think primarily I agree with Ngozi. We've been talking about it for, far too long, and we need to do now. And I think in doing, we also need to be considered in what we do. And I think oftentimes when these conversations are happening, so if I maybe just give my own perspective from within the museum, oftentimes when these conversations arise, or that they're more so within the public realm, the question first comes around, questions of restitution or repatriation in particular. And I think for us, one of the things that I think that's, really important is where that sits within the overall conversation around the decolonization of the museum. And both Ngozi and Donal have mentioned, within our sort of historical museums, we have structures and ways of collecting and ways of naming, actually, that have a huge implication in terms of how things are interpreted, how they're displayed, whether they're displayed or not. So, in the case of the National Museum of Ireland, a lot of our ethnographic material, as it's named, is not on display. It's within storage. And so I think all of these things are things that we need action on. I think Ngozi makes the point that there's a frustration of museums sort of saying we need more resources, we don't have enough people. And I take that on board. I think that is what we say all the time. It's true as well, but it's not an excuse. It shouldn't be an excuse. It should be something that just gets factored into how we start to take action, I think. But for me, I think one of the elements of it that's really important is taking that holistic approach and being open to being challenged and being open to questions across all of the elements of what we do, right? So, right down to our acquisition policies that, are in place for our current collections, and how we make decisions about what we acquire and why we acquire it, and, what its purpose within the museum is, how is it going to be displayed, interpreted, how do we invite, other voices and communities into that conversation. I mean, just even on a element within, the National Museum of Ireland, at the moment we're doing a project called Mincare.ie, which is the development of a digital platform around a lot of our collection that is part of the traveller community in Ireland. And when we did that exhibition the first time, there was very clearly a number of items within our collection that were misrepresented, or, completely the interpretation of their use and how they was wrong. And so we fortunately have just received funding, so there'll be a new role going out in the coming weeks for a curator of traveller culture to work with the museum in looking at that. And I think what's really critical about those roles is thinking about who is in those roles and what, and those communities are actually working in our museum, and that we start to shift this, frankly, in the case of museums in Ireland, a very white, a very non-diverse workforce as well, which has implications on the way that we work. So, look, I think, all of those elements are in play at the moment, and what's really important is thinking strategically about how we approach them, so that we're not. My fear always with these things is that it becomes really reactive, and that people start to think, well, and I think Donal mentioned this a little bit in terms of maybe how this discourse is continuing in the public case, perhaps more so in the UK, I think, than in Ireland, right? That it's in that kind of culture wars, and it's talked about in that context. And I think so far in Ireland, we've been fortunate that the conversation has been perhaps, and I see Donal nodding his head, so hopefully, he agrees. It's been a little bit more nuanced. It's been a little bit more thoughtful. And I think that probably does have to do with the more complex relationship that we have with colony. and being a colony. And so, look, I think action is needed, and I think that action has to come fast, but I think that action also has to be embedded in a longer term plan. This is a long journey that I think we're all, genuinely, we all are genuinely signed up to and involved in, but we can't just keep talking about it, as Ngozi says. Let's crack on.
Right. But Lynn, would you say that the challenges lies more in the, is it an institutional challenge, or is it a systematic challenge in terms of how institutions are set up, how transparent and how open institutions actually are? Is sort of working with communities, the sort of the all-saving solution for that, or does it go beyond? And I mean, this question goes to all of you. I would assume that it also refers to universities as, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I jumped in there, Han. I think, Han-Sung, I think it's both. I think it's institutional, but I think it's also systematic. It's policies, it's procedures, it's it's all of the structures of the institutions that by which how we're set up. But then it's also the everything from the policies about how we develop our exhibitions and what we see as being co-curatorial processes or participative processes, and how we embed those into our programming. But it's also, the name of, of our different curatorial areas, which, and how we catalog material and the language that we use. I mean, Leila will talk about that as well. So it's many different elements. And I think what we need to do is in some ways approach it in a systematic way and say, okay, so within a sort of pillar of the culture of our institutions, what are the key actions and that we need to take here within a pillar of sort of systems and procedures of our institutions? What do we need to look at here? Within a pillar of how we program and engage within our institutions, what do we need to look at here? And start to set out a clearer pathway, because all of those pieces are always interacting together. So it's very difficult, I think, to just focus in on one area and tackle that solely.
I mean, to me, it seems that, as you rightfully stated, Lynn, that indeed, I mean, it refers to institutional structures. But it also refers to a way of thinking and a deep embedded attitude. And it seems that a lot of it continues to connect with, especially when we talk about about Europe and the West, that like it so deeply embedded Western normative is creating these huge challenges that that it create ignorances and blind spots which we have to overcome. Lida, I mean, maybe we can dive a little bit into language, because language are always representatives of systems of thinking. How does it appear to you?
Yeah, I mean, what you just said there, Lynn, certainly resonated, but also like the language used by the institution in bringing about change. And I think one thing that is, like as speaking as someone, working in universities rather than museums, but of course, like on the one hand, there is this positive and hopeful moment of like, I'd say like more people in powerful positions in universities having realized, like at the latest last summer during the Black Lives Matter protests there, and thanks to kind of tireless organizing, also preceding. That some things got to change, and specifically in the languages department, or zooming in on German studies, there were like a lot of statements in the last year, right, of also German studies organizations, German studies departments kind of vowing to do better, to become more diverse, to decolonize their curricula and so forth. And one really pressing issue there, and something that is luckily also being quite openly discussed among among academics in that field at the moment, is that then, like, you know, how to ensure that those kind of statements don't just reproduce the kind of exclusionary mechanisms they are writing against. So they are, so, you know, like, and particularly it's something that's very much at the heart of my research in the literature I look at, but that then also translates into the kind of language used in these institutional contexts, is like who's speaking as the we, who's presumed as the we, and, you know, and if you get these institutional statements that kind of speak, set up a we that vows to do, but that just assumes the university to be white and to be, or, like, you know, or that just assumes the students to be students who are all expecting to only read books by German authors and so forth, or, like, isn't that kind of just like for anyone that doesn't apply to, that just reinscribes the kind of like, oh, well, even when the statements are being made, the kind of community that is presumed is not the one that's really there. And of course, there is the issue of certainly, like, institutions largely being very white, but then by assuming them as all white, there's kind of like an exclusion of those people who are already there, or like assuming them as being, I don't know, like, as in, you know, that kind of language of like, us as an incredibly white middle class department and so forth, and then kind of ignoring who in that department that might not be applied to and so forth. So I find it, particularly in the realm of literary studies, I find it, like a kind of interesting development now to have people also come together and like analyze their own language in these kind of moments, in the kind of open letters that are being produced and so forth. But I'm very aware also, sorry, that we're coming to the end of the time. So I just want to stress there that I feel the fact that these things are being analyzed on that meta level, and that while certainly, I mean, there's lots of the statements that were being put out last year did seem like, or weren't necessarily all great in their language, but I feel like the fact that is being openly addressed, and that that it can be addressed in a way that doesn't just get the reaction of like, oh, you know, like, what more do you want? There's already been a lovely statement. The fact that things are kind of like that those spaces for critique are opening up are, I guess, like the in we can build on to make sure that it's not performative change, but that there's actual institutional change, which I guess museums and universities are kind of equally hard to change, but equally worthwhile in pushing towards change. Yeah.
Donal, what would you say? I mean, who's more advanced, museums or universities in this term, in this discourse?
I'm not sure. I would say, I'm not sure. I think in Ireland, we've just had a release of a report yesterday, which was about race inequality within our university system, and was very revealing of the way academics of colour have been experiencing teaching in what is a hegemonically white institution, and that has revealed both some of the difficulties, the challenges facing people, but also that there is a space opening, and like Lynn has said, you know, there is a space opening within the heritage sector, and I'm hopeful that there may be a space opening within the university sector here for change. But we should always be cautiously optimistic and vigilant against empty rhetoric that's not followed up with policy.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but maybe a very, very, very last question, maybe like a quick response for everyone. Do you believe that we have a crisis of representation, and is contemporary art the solution for it, because as we know, contemporary art has overcome the issue of representation a long time ago. Maybe very, very quick intake from everyone until before we sum up the session.
It seems Ngosi's microphone is playing havoc, which is a shame because she's the person it would be great to hear from.
It's acting up.
Well, I think Ngosi's microphone shows what contemporary art can do, which is disrupt the kind of hegemonic modes of representation. And I think that's what's great about contemporary art. So.
Okay. I don't know what.
Sorry, there might be an issue with the mic, Ngozi. Anyone else want to go first before maybe in the meanwhile Ngozi can check the mic?
I guess what I'd say again, like clearly it's not as quick and easy a question, just technologically to answer, but also I'd say in just purely content levels, I do not find that that I can give a quick answer to that. Certainly, like as in the question of like whether art could provide a kind of solution to. Like the current moment to the crisis of representation, because of course there's also it's such a wide discussion about what makes for as an how to do it badly and well. I mean, there's certainly a lot like very bad bad art and bad modes of representation out there, but even the good ones, or like the ones like that, I could go into large arguments about why I think they like. There's absolutely, I have my wonderful books here that I could talk about what I think they do well, and how I think that kind of literature absolutely is what this moment needs. But I think it's crucial also that literature won't save us in that moment, and that I think is particularly why I'm so interested also in authors who themselves are kind of like also going down, are also outspoken and kind of advocating for political change outside of their literature, and who I can't obviously speak for all the authors I work on, but I think there is definitely a community of authors. Both in the German context and in the British context, which I'm also working on, where like we're very aware that a kind of romanticized notion of literature alone won't bring about the societal change that is needed, but that there has to be organizing outside, like both organizing in those spheres, organizing in the sphere of publishing, where all the same injustices are reproduced, organizing in the sphere of the university. And I'm sure, even though that's not so much my area of expertise, but I'm sure there's a lot of organizing for institutional change in the world of museums. So I think it's very much like art bearing a lot of hopeful potential there, but that it can't be the final. Like it would be nice if it was just if a good novel on representation could just end the crisis, but I'm afraid I don't think that.
Thanks, Laila. Ngozi, I think you're back. It seems the mic is working.
I think, okay, it's working now. Yes. Well, I don't think, in my humble opinion, that contemporary art would change much in the crisis of representation, but I think it will keep expanding in the individual perspective. Like it will keep expanding the way we approach it and all. But is it going to change anything immediately or right now? I'm not sure. We just have to keep redefining, like keep creating works that that are not representational, but kind of understanding the space that we find ourselves in. That's one way I look at it. But if it's going to change anything quickly, I really don't see it right now. Yeah.
I think that it's I think that we can't just say something that we were relying on artists to be the ones that disrupt and challenge. And I think fundamentally what we're saying here is that there's a collective responsibility here, and the work of wonderful artists can give us new ways of seeing and learning, and they can draw our attention to a point that's really critical in terms of our understanding of a particular time and place and context. But this is an emergency like climate change. This is something that we have to collectively embrace and approach. And I think that if we consistently rely on if we consistently, expect, actually is probably a better descriptive. If we consistently expect that artists are going to carry that burden of disrupting and challenging all the time, I think that's unfair, actually. I think that it's a collective responsibility that we all need to take on and recognize the urgency of it, actually. So yes, so I think I think it's part of it, but I think it's unfair to expect it always the artists are carrying that. I think that as institutions, as individuals, as communities, all of those pieces are together.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you for you all to participating in this roundtable tonight. We have come to the end. We are a little bit above the time. It was a very, very wide topic, and I very much appreciate the many different perspectives and views we have collected here. It's my feeling that we could just talk more over hours, and but I hope that this was an interesting starting point for all of us. For me, certainly. Thank you very much. It was certainly a lot of food for thoughts. I'm taking away too. For me, I also would like to thank again the Goethe-Institut for hosting us, and also Ulrike and Caroline for the invitation and the wonderful organization and having us here. I hope that one or the other of us can stay in touch, and that we will find other opportunities to continue this conversation about these or similar issues. Again, thank you all. All the best for your endeavors and projects. And yes, and also all the best for the continuing series of Cultúr Raum, which in my belief continues in context of the 60 years anniversary of the Goethe-Institut Ireland. Thank you very much, and see you soon again.